Thank you all. My name is Erin Kearns, and I am the head of Prevention Research Initiatives here at NCITE, and I'm also a professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice. I'm very excited to be the moderator of today's panel, where we're talking about preventing terrorism and targeted violence. Today we'll have 5 presentations that will start off a little bit out of order because I didn't put the slides in order on accident. If we're going to be completely frank, I got a little overzealous with learning how to put slides with different formats into the same PowerPoint and didn't pay attention to the ordering. So we'll kick off first with a presentation by Dr. Devra Margoulan. She'll be talking about the reintegration of foreign fighter families. Next will be a presentation by Dr. Kearns talking about partnering with families to prevent radicalization. After that, we'll have a presentation by Dr. Pete Simi talking about threats to public officials. Following that, a presentation by Dr. Matt Allen talking about whether or not prevention programming is effective. And then lastly, I am not presenting my own research because that feels weird to moderate a panel and present on the same panel. My co-PI on a project, Dr. Justin Nix, will be presenting on a project looking at insider threats in US law enforcement. So I will turn it over now to Dr. Dev Margoulan.
The green one. No. Perfect. Thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Dr. Devra Margoulan, and I'm grateful to work on this project with several researchers, including Dr. Austin Doctor, who is here as well. In my previous capacity, I was a senior fellow at the George Washington University, which is where I started this project. I have now transitioned to join the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, but am continuing to work on this project, and I'm very excited to be here today. This project is a collaboration between GW, UNO, as well as ICCT in The Hague. We have Dr. Julie Coleman and Dr. Haroro Ingram, who are part of this project as well. We're also extremely grateful to DHS, S&T for all of their support on this project. No? Okay. So what is the goal of this project? We are asking the question, what are the best practices for the repatriation and reintegration of foreign terrorist fighter families? Specifically, these are women and minors. The problem that we're addressing here in the United States, there is an estimated 300 individuals or US persons who have traveled to join the Islamic State. 39 of those individuals have been officially repatriated, and I will get into that number shortly and what official repatriation means. Our method for addressing this question is 3-pronged. So the first is to review the literature on foreign terrorist fighters, specifically with a gender and age-based focus. The second is to review the literature on repatriation and reintegration. And second of all, we are doing field work. We have been lucky enough to travel to the Netherlands and Iraq to talk to practitioners who have been running these programs in both of these countries, asking them questions such as, how are you going through this process? What are the main challenges that you're facing? There will also be upcoming field work here in Nebraska, where we'll be looking at what local programs may already actually be in place for us to utilize. Third, we are going to be writing a framework for our partners to understand this issue and best approach this question. We've learned some lessons so far. Specifically, we have significant knowledge gaps, and this is not a bad thing. Understanding what these knowledge gaps are and learning from them and focusing on them is a very important part of our study. We also have the ability to learn from others. It's really important to know that we are not the only country that is facing this problem. There are many other countries that are doing it. They've been dealing with it on a much larger scale than we are in the United States. And more so, they're doing it quite publicly. I think what's interesting about the US is it's not necessarily that public how this process is ongoing, but other countries such as the Netherlands or Iraq, where we got to go and talk to practitioners, this has been a very public process, and so we can learn from them as well. And finally, we have a number of products that have come out of this. We have an article in the Journal for De-Radicalization. We've also published some shorter pieces in the Washington Post, for a Nexus blog, as well as with the Washington Institute. So why does this all matter? So the foreign terrorist fighter problem is a nonpartisan issue here in the United States. It's been a call under both President Trump and President Biden to repatriate foreign terrorist fighter families. As I mentioned, approximately 300 individuals traveled to join the Islamic State. 39 to date have been repatriated, but the scope of the issue is actually much larger than that. An estimated 43,000 foreign terrorist fighters, men, women, and children. And I should very much clarify, foreign terrorist fighter is kind of this overarching term. We can call them foreign travelers, foreign terrorist fighter families. These are individuals who chose to leave their countries of origin to travel to join a group and become part of this group. And so we know that there are about 43,000 of these individuals. The majority of them are actually Iraqi citizens. So when we talk about non-local citizens, these include Iraqis, as well as individuals from over 60 different countries. 27,000 of these are children. In fact, if we look at Al Hol, which currently has about 55,000 individuals, half of the people in that camp are minors under the age of 12. When we talk about this large group of people, the majority of them are held in camps. The majority are women and minors. These are individuals who are held in camps such as Al Hol or Al Roj, but there are also a number of prison facilities holding approximately 10,000 foreign men, as well as almost an estimated 300 to 400 minors that are held in these prison facilities with adult men. If we look at Al Hol specifically, we know that there are 25,000 Iraqis in the camp and 10,000 other foreigners held in these populations. But there's a number of security issues that are involved as well, these security concerns. What does this elongated detention mean? State Department CT official Ian Moss said in July, "We can't artificially separate our concern for the displacement and detention issues from the broader context, political context in Northeast Syria, for the simple fact that the more financial resources and room to operate that IS enjoys, the more complex and or frequent their efforts to free detainees, recruit displaced persons in the camps will be." And we've seen this happen over the last, since 2019, the fall of Baghouz, the fall of the physical caliphate. We have seen an influx. The Islamic State views these supporters, these IS affiliated individuals in the camp as the future of their resurgence. They have used these camps to recruit, to radicalize, and to frame their resurgence should it happen. We saw this in a number of murders and killings that have been happening in the camps between 2020 and 2021. There was an SDF operation with the support of the United States in 2021, which sought to kind of quell this resurgence. Again, we saw in 2022, we saw the Grand Prison attacks and other attacks as well, in which IS tried to push back again. And we recently had a 24-day SDS operation to again quell the extremists in the camp. And why this matters is that there are also these humanitarian concerns. We know that there is inadequate access to food, water, education, and healthcare. And the longer individuals are held in these camps, not only are we going to have the humanitarian concerns, but coupled with the security concerns is going to be a larger problem for the stability of the Middle East. So we have, as I mentioned, we did two reviews. So the first is the origins of the problem, the foreign terrorist fighter life cycle, as we call it, the pre-departure phase, the in-theater phase, and the return phase. And what we tried to do is do this with a gendered and age-based focus. We also did fieldwork, as I mentioned, in the Netherlands and Iraq, where we got to speak to the practitioners implementing these programs and the issues that they're facing. I'm going to quickly jump because we're losing time. As I mentioned, we have three key knowledge gaps. The first is the interconnectivity of the foreign terrorist fighter family. Often the literature focuses on adult men, but what that lacks is an understanding of women's experiences and varying levels of agency, as well as the understanding that minors should be seen primarily as victims. We also have an issue with the pathways of return. Often our rhetoric focuses on formal repatriation. However, even here in the United States, we understand there are formal pathways of return. For example, our research has found an additional 20 adults and 20 minors who came back to the United States not through formal pathways. And so the scope of the issue might actually be larger than how we calculate it. And finally is the consequences of long-term detention, what we call perhaps the fourth stage of the life cycle. This elongated detention has not been studied enough to understand what this means. Very quickly again, just preliminary insights. We really need to focus on the intersection of age and gender in the reintegration process. We need a synchronized parallel understanding of the prosecution of parents as well as the reintegration of children. We need to focus on the politicization and stigmatization that may present structural challenges towards reintegration. There needs to be a holistic approach to communication, implementation, and oversight. I also want to leave on a slightly positive note that there are steps in the right direction. The issue of repatriation, while in the United States has been a nonpartisan issue, across Europe and other partners has very much been lagging. In this last month alone, we saw long-resistant partners, including Australia and and France, begin to repatriate, and that is a step in the right direction. We also saw the ICRC is willing to appoint a special representative to look at the situation in a whole and elongated detention. Finally, Iraq has made really great steps since May 2021 to repatriate, but there are still many structural challenges, including the pace that it is happening, as well as issues including security, documentation, and social cohesion. Thank you so much.
It's kind of strange seeing yourself like. My name's Kearns from the University of Maine, and we talk about how we can partner with families to prevent radicalization and mobilization. So family members are often the first people to observe or witness the radicalization process, which makes them incredibly important in mitigating and stopping the radicalization process. But there are certainly a number of issues with this. Family members might not even understand what they're observing, right? They don't know what the warning signs are, don't know what radicalization is or terrorism is. And this is also problematic for CVE agencies. You know, we need family members to report suspicious behaviors, whether it's to the FBI, which doesn't happen all that often, but also to just other members of the community or to self-help groups, whatever it may be. You know, there's a lot of fear among family members about what's going to happen if they do report problematic behavior. So my goal, I'm in year 3 of this project, was to really figure out what was happening at home with the family members. So I've been doing life history interviews with family members of all forms of, well, all people with all different forms of extremism. I started mostly with Islamic extremism, but I'm expanding it to all of them. I've interviewed 15 family members up to date. I have about 45 hours of interview data, 1,000 pages of transcription, so a lot. It's just some key results for the first 2 years. First is that family members report a wide range of non-ideological risk factors in their child or family members' lives. I'm talking like acute, serious family violence, witnessing family violence, victimization. And also these family members had varying degrees of understanding and acknowledging what they were seeing, that for experts in this room, we would know immediately that this is extremism, this is radicalization. And I'm going to expand on these 2 findings in a minute. I have, for those who want some light reading, I do have a few copies of my year 2 report that breaks all this down in much greater detail. I've done some public-facing work, some op-eds, and I can share that as requested. So I'm hoping that the font is large enough for folks in the room. But as you can see on the slide, Among the family members who did radicalize, as reported by their family members, we see high rates of non-ideological risk factors, but it's the polyvictimization that I really want to draw your attention to. 44% of the extremists experienced multiple forms of victimization at home and violence. Incredibly concerning. I'm a former social worker, and having these conversations, it really is shocking. We see high rates of various disruptions throughout their childhoods and into adolescence. And all of this really supports the idea that adversity makes some people vulnerable to radicalization. So as I'm having conversations with these family members, these participants are describing their day-to-day lives and their experiences with their family members' radicalization. And every single person saw warning signs, and this is just a short list of some of them. And these are all well documented in the literature. But the barrier here is that the family members' ability to acknowledge or even understand that these are in fact warning signs of kind of like an impending doom. For some of them, it did not end well. So for these family members that are trying to figure out what's going on in their child or loved ones or siblings' life, they tend to fall into three categories. The first one is that they were just completely unaware of warning signs, and 5 of the participants fell in here. And are we doing all right? Yeah, okay. So I'll just read these excerpts because I'm not sure if you can read the slides, but one person's like, I didn't even know what extremism was. I didn't know what radical was. If you'd asked me any of those questions before, I would have said, huh? Second is that they were aware that these warning signs were problematic, but they didn't realize that it was severe. And they said, we didn't actually realize how serious it had become until the moment when the FBI had showed up at our door. And they had done they went down to the mosque, right, to find out what was going on. Why is my son acting like this? And but it never really triggered that they were seeing violent radicalization. And then I had a group of folks who were aware of warning signs and aware that they were warning signs, right? So this is a longer quote, but some folks knew that it was a problem, were very concerned, but they still didn't exactly report to the FBI right away. So just kind of given these findings, the next step is to make sense of the timeline, so to speak. What do families do and when do they do it when they start to acknowledge the radicalization process? So that's what my year 3 plan is, basically this year and hopefully next year, is to explore something that I'm calling inadvertent push factors into extremism. This is for families who, as you saw, these kids had rough upbringings, they're skipping school, they're getting into fights, all sorts of, I heard it all. Acute violence, some tough stuff. But for the parents in particular, they were really happy that their kid has found a group of friends, or that they were finding more structure by going to the mosque or doing whatever. And not that the parents are pushing them into extremism, but they were happy to see this happening, right? They were making friends and going out. They didn't know that they were planning a bombing, right? But they were happy otherwise. Second point is thinking about intervention points. So did family members try to intervene, and when? At what point did they call for support? And certainly some folks have called the FBI, but it's more about, when do they reach out to people in the community, to therapists or to teachers, right, other people in the community? And then to keep talking to family members about what has helped them, right, as families, right? So they're still families. We want them to maintain cohesion and to have be a safe space, and keep these relationships together, right? We don't want to see divorced parents. We don't want to see kids in prison. So what is working, what's not, for them to maintain some semblance of normalcy during and after the radicalization process. And in part, we can help figure out what is preventing families from going to the FBI or to reporting these suspicious activities. And then, the agencies can start to leverage that relationship, because we need to rely on the family members, right, to report without fear of what will happen after reporting. So for actionable outcomes when it comes to those first two findings I talked about earlier. So with non-ideological risk factors, we really need to have a conversation around our punitive responses to extremism. I have my PhD in criminology and criminal justice from UNO, and we know that we are not rehabilitating anybody in prison. So we need to start talking about maybe a public health approach for certain offenders, right? But if we know that these kids are survivors of polyvictimization, what is prison going to do for them, especially if they're going to be released? It's going to make it worse. Second is the observed missed and misunderstood warning signs. So we need to increase education in communities. I know in the state of Maine, the FBI is going all over the state this year, meeting with leaders in the public school system to talk about what radicalization is, what extremism is, and what are the warning signs. I'm trying to get in on that, so TBD. And then just to decrease stigma around extremism and radicalization so that parents in particular, but spouses, children, siblings, are more likely to speak up when they are seeing concerning behaviors. Because one of the things I've heard from every single person I talk to is that they are terrified that if they call the police, their child's going to prison or worse. And that's it. So I finished a minute early. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. First, I want to thank NCITE and DHS for support and for making this event possible, and also acknowledge my collaborators on this project, Seamus Hughes at George Washington and Keitha White at American University, and a small team of undergraduate student researchers at Chapman, which is really exciting to see them get to be involved in this kind of research with the kind of real world implications that studying threats to public officials has. And two of the students actually are getting ready to apply for grad school. A third one is in the process of applying for law school, would like to join the FBI as an agent at some point. And the fourth one's just starting her undergrad career and hopes to run for Congress one day. So no shortage of ambition with that group, and it's really fun to see them dig into this research. Also wanted to share a story that I shared with the students when we first started working on the project to underscore the ubiquitous nature of threats to public officials. As part of my own personal kind of efforts to remain timely with online chatter among extremists, I spend a lot of time on public-facing social media platforms like Telegram and Gab and many others. And not too long ago, I was on Telegram reviewing a white supremacist channel that was based in the southeastern part of the United States. And I came across multiple posts that referenced a very specific mayor in a small town in the southeastern United States that declared her an enemy of white people and listed her name, reference to her children, home address, and photos of her likeness. So the posts were, in my view, threatening enough that I felt compelled to contact local FBI authorities that I worked with in the past in Southern California and asked them if they could share with their colleagues in the Southeast. And then sent the mayor the posts as well, and she responded that she was going to share them with her head of security and the chief of police there. So it's unfortunate that any of us in a relatively short period of time could find something similar on any number of Telegram channels and many other online platforms. But it also underscores the importance of trying to better understand the nature and prevalence of threats to public officials, potential policy implications, and what these threats tell us about the current crisis we face today. So to answer the question in the title, public officials are facing lots of threats. They're multifaceted, wide range of offenders with a wide range of grievances are communicating these threats in a wide range of different means. And of course, this raises a lot of important questions about threat assessment and investigation and ultimately enforcement and prosecution. Now, as a starting point, let me just say that we're focused on what we refer to as communicated threats. So that is where a person or persons, either orally or in writing, and it could be hard copy writing, old-fashioned way, via a letter of some kind, could be electronic or digital, could be telephone. In some cases, folks are communicating threats via videos that they then send to the targets. So the format, the way in which the threats are communicated varies quite a bit. But in our case, we're looking at threats that involve a statement that expresses intent to harm the person, the recipient, in some capacity. And we're specifically focusing on public officials in terms of elected officials, election officials, law enforcement, education, and healthcare. And let me just give you a couple data points specific to election officials that are recent, that I imagine will give us all pause. Recent survey by the Brennan Center found that 70% of election officials believe that threats are increasing over recent years, and 1 in 6 indicated directly receiving a threat themselves. According to Mary McCord, former U.S. attorney, 50 out of 67 Pennsylvania counties have had election chiefs recently leave because of threats. So let's step back and talk a little bit more broadly about how we see this particular problem set and some of our deficiencies in terms of our current understanding. There's a tendency to view threats to public officials as idiosyncratic nuisances. We think this is a mistake. Why? Because threats taken together influence and are influenced by a larger political and cultural climate. And this goes to the point Martha was making earlier about this issue as it relates to prevention in what her comments were referencing, but the difficulty, the challenges that we face in terms of growing popular support for certain sensibility, including support for the use of violence, which would include the use of these kinds of threats to essentially interrupt democratic principles and practices. So really, in whole, threats taken as a whole do represent a direct challenge to democracy. Now, how so? Democracy requires a free exchange of ideas that may involve confrontation, including actions and words, and of course, those are very healthy signs of a vibrant democracy. But threats are something very different, both in the singular and the plural. They involve coercion and intimidation to express opposition with the explicit warning that absent capitulation, violence will follow suit. In other words, in all cases, threats represent, even in their kind of seemingly most incoherent forms, an effort to disrupt the normal course of democratic decision-making. And most striking, threats need not be executed for them to be effective. So even without bullets, explosives, lives can be ruined, intimidation achieved, and the legitimacy of democratic institutions weakened. Now, from a legal or a public standpoint, it's obviously crucial to assess whether a particular threat is likely to be acted upon, and which in turn obviously creates all sorts of interesting questions from an investigative perspective, and eventually in terms of punishment should any occur. For example, how much discretion should an investigator employ when a federal crime has likely been committed, but the execution of the threat related to that crime is perceived to be relatively minimal? Or how much punishment is appropriate for an individual convicted of, say, 3 counts of threats to public officials, but who in actuality communicated literally hundreds of these types of threats directed towards public officials? Now, these types of questions are not exclusive or unique to this particular type of crime, but there are additional layers of complexity that are added when dealing with a crime like threats to public officials, when they're perceived, at least by some, as having less tangible harm associated with them. So now let's talk about our specific project and our methodological approach. We're beginning by focusing on federal indictments that involve threat to public officials from 2016 to the present. We've archived more than 350 DOJ press releases related to such cases and are now gathering publicly available court documents for each case. We've designed a code book that's kind of guiding our analysis of these records so that we're focusing on victim, offender, and event characteristics. And we've coded about 50 cases so far, so we're really early in the process. So I want to be very cautious in terms of any kind of preliminary results. In terms of the volume of cases over that time frame from 2016 to the present, we see the largest jump in terms of about a 35% increase from 17 to 18. 18 to 19, we saw about a 20% increase, and then the more recent years has been pretty steady. The vast majority of the indictments involve threats to elected officials, mostly congressional, although some executive branch as well. And of course, as we get further in the process, we're looking forward to being able to say more about the characteristics, including the extent to which ideological motivations play a role when we're able to discern those factors. The project's also going to give us an opportunity to do some pretty intensive case studies with some of the incidents, and we would like to expand beyond year one from the federal indictments into a larger pool of data. And as part of the work that we're doing this year, we'll be holding end user meetings in order to get a better idea of what types of specific aspects of the analysis and the data that we've been collecting and are analyzing would be most helpful from a practitioner perspective in terms of on the ground. So now, let me step back again and address how we see these threats more broadly and how they're interwoven within a larger context. This figure represents three components of the current crisis that we see. From our preliminary analysis, we know that many of the threats are driven by very specific grievances or concerns related to disinformation. For example, things related to vaccine conspiracy theories or the COVID conspiracy theories more broadly. This is interwoven with the importance of the role of different types of events, mobilization events such as public rallies, in some cases perfectly legal, in other cases not. In some cases like J6, starting legally and then moving into illegal behavior. In any case, those events are important in part because they're organized to help disseminate disinformation, and they're organized in part as a way to express some of the threats, as was the case in J6 when Vice President Pence's life was threatened, as were congressional officials. So the point is really to address the threats that we have in terms of directed towards public officials by not only seeing them in isolation, but looking at how they're connected to disinformation and mobilization events. And most importantly, seeing how threats to public officials are really a symptom of a larger attack on democracy. So I'll end it there. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about prevention programming more broadly. Recently, NCITE had received an award from the Department of Homeland Security to evaluate two grant prevention programs. One of them is the Invent to Prevent program, and the other one is the TVTP, Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention program. So I'm representing a very large research team right now. Several researchers here at NCITE, as well as research teams at RTI International, led by Matthew DeMichelle and Sarah Cook, as well as the University of Nebraska Public Policy Center, led by Dr. Denise Bowling. So I just wanted to give acknowledgement to all of those collaborators. My presentation is going to be a little bit different than some of the other ones that have come so far because the project just kicked off a few weeks ago. So what I'm going to be talking about is sort of what we're trying to accomplish, the operating context that we're working in, and then just kind of circle back to what our goals are for the project. So As described on the slide there, DHS makes millions of grant dollars available for local prevention programs. This is part of a national security strategy pillar. It's in several documents, such as the Strategic Framework for Counterterrorism and Targeted Violence, National Strategy for Countering Domestic Extremism, and the recently released National Security Strategy in Part 3. So this is listed in a variety of government documents as a critical pillar for national security strategy. One of these programs is the Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Program that I'll talk about in a few more slides. So the problem, there's a need to systematically evaluate these programs and grant recipients to inform key stakeholders in future practice. So as I'll talk about in a minute, these programs, or the use of these programs and systematically looking at them, is a little bit more recent, and so we're going to be adding some methodology to that. We'll accomplish this by developing program, track, and grantee evaluation frameworks, making evaluation determinations, and developing a proof of concept evaluation model. So what our anticipated deliverables are, number one is to report summarizing evaluation activities. And then importantly, we also want to develop a toolkit for stakeholders. This might include grant recipients, this might include managers and others that can input information about grant performance in a systematic way. So to get into some background here, earlier this year, NCITE submitted a briefing memo to the House Committee on Homeland Security. The topic of this briefing memo was a state of the science assessment of targeted violence and terrorism prevention programs. We wanted to kind of look at what was the current evidence for what works and to inform future efforts. So the researchers who were working on this at NCITE started by reviewing over 300 peer-reviewed sources and found a few things that were interesting. So one, most of the work, at least the evaluation work, had been done since 2017. So this is still a fairly new area of inquiry in that sense, that most of the work is recent. The second thing, targeted violence and terrorism prevention is a multidimensional and multidisciplinary area of practice. So there are criminologists, public health perspectives going into this, education, psychology, and so our responses and our approaches to targeted violence and terrorism prevention programming should also be multidisciplinary. They found that the focus on risk and protective factors are most likely to reduce violence in communities. So not just looking at risk factors, but also those kind of hardening or resilience factors. Most of the successful programs were also situated within the community. So they were very community specific and driven in that way and focused in that area. Finally, and importantly to the rest of our study and the rest of my talk here, is that there's significant challenges to conducting evaluations of these grant programs. For one, because violence is a low base rate phenomenon, it's something that's difficult to conduct outcome and impact evaluations. And also, it's really the evaluation process needs to be considered as part of developing the program and actually considering what the program is trying to do. So that's a difficult thing to do for some of these programs. Sometimes these are small grant recipients, sometimes these are local communities that may not know how to actually do that incorporation. With this research, there's a proliferation and a lot of evaluation toolkits that are out there corresponding to this trend. So for example, the United Nations has developed some toolkits, as has the RAND Corporation. There's people in the Australian government who have also developed some great evaluation guides. These toolkits are great resources. And they're very well done, but there's challenges with trying to apply them to the DHS context for a few reasons. Specifically, number one, they're tend to be focused on one type of programming. They tend to operate under the assumption that there's a group, and that group has a messaging, and an individual is radicalized to that message, and that's where the violence happens. But we know from some of the remarks earlier, some of the remarks that Dr. Geltzer, Dr. Crenshaw, and Dr. Hughes made this morning, that doesn't necessarily cover all types of individuals who may be more personally radicalized for more personal reasons, or individuals who might commit violence for other reasons. So we need to expand this toolkit out for the DHS context because the TVTB grant program focuses on more than just one type. The second is that these toolkits are very complex. It takes a lot of work to actually implement them. If an individual, a grantee, was trying to utilize these toolkits to say, how would I evaluate my program? There's just a lot of information, a lot of complexity, a lot of different considerations. And so because of that, that's another reason that makes it hard to apply these toolkits for these grantees in the TVTP grant program. Finally, there's limited information about maintenance and adaptation. Given that this is a rapidly changing area of inquiry, and we must build this evaluation into the grant program so that we can inform future practice and actually inform what's going on in the future. And this adaptation is critical when we're talking about program sustainability. Often we design these programs such that or we want them to be administered, but then we want them to continue beyond their life, maybe perhaps scaling that beyond that. So understanding what is it the key components and the core components of those programs and what can be adapted to different circumstances is really key. So the TVTP, let's talk a little bit more about the Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Program. It's a DHS grant program for reducing violence in our communities. And as described on the slide, TVTP funds a wide range of institutions to establish or enhance capabilities to prevent targeted violence and terrorism. It's managed by CP3, the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnership. And what is specifically funded, or what the kind of focus areas of the grant program changes annually. So in fiscal year 22, that's what's up on the slide on the right-hand side there. These are the focus areas for that year. And there were 43 projects funded with $20 million in funding for those 43 projects. So, and again, this is a key part of the national security strategy, and so there's been talk about perhaps even increasing this funding further. And because of this funding, and for a variety of other reasons, there's a lot of scrutiny on these programs. Both there's been some attention from the General Accountability Office, as well as concerns about from civil liberties groups. So, project outcomes and goals. The things that we're planning to do on this project, number one is to develop an overall evaluation framework. To date, most of the work that's been done in evaluating these programs has been on individual grantees. So there will be somebody who comes in, there's a program going on, somebody will come in post hoc or during while the grants are going on and try to conduct a program evaluation of those grantees. What we want to do is develop a framework that can be used at multiple levels, kind of the highest level of the TVTP program, as well as these kind of middle levels, as well as the individual grant level. We're going to develop a proof of concept toolkit for grantee evaluation. So again, this is some kind of data collection system that can be used by grantees and grant managers. We'll also be, as part of this project, this will be led by our partners at RTI International, evaluating specific grantees, specifically 14 grantees, 7 from the fiscal year 2021 program, and 7 from the fiscal year 2022 program. And finally, conducting interviews with a variety of stakeholders, as well as convening an expert panel. We'll also provide recommendations for long-term strategy and for program sustainability. So we're just getting this project off the ground. I do want to plug, though, that we have a couple of posters outside for some of our initial thinking on this. One is feeding into the toolkit work and talking about training and development and how those models might be used to develop a toolkit. And then we also have another poster that has data visualizations of what has been done to date in the TVTP grant program. And that can help policy and decision makers to understand, what have we funded previously? Is this the right mix of things that we're doing? So thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Justin Nix. There's quite an echo up here. I'm an associate professor here at the University of Nebraska-Omaha in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice, and it's my pleasure today to speak with you for a few minutes about some ongoing work funded by DHS I'm doing with my wonderful colleague, Dr. Kearns, Jesse Huff, and Sadaf Hashimi, all in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice. So, insider threats in law enforcement, or the potential for it, is not a new concern. The FBI has warned about this for years, but it came back to the collective conscious January 6, 2021, when many officers, I say many, There were anecdotal accounts of officers from agencies across the US who attended the insurrection at the Capitol. The question we really want to answer is, what's the extent of this problem? We don't really have any systematic data that tells us, X% of police officers in this country hold white supremacist beliefs or otherwise constitute some sort of insider threat to their agencies. It's quite a difficult question to answer. The nature of law enforcement in this country is fractured and localized. Some 18,000 departments. We'd like to do a survey of the department and ask officers questions that might lead to answers about the extent of their insider threats in their agencies, but obviously there are concerns about social desirability bias and generalizability if we were to just sample one or even a dozen agencies. So I think a question that's more manageable for us to try to tackle is, what are agencies doing about the problem? How much of a problem do they perceive it to be? And what are they proactively doing to screen for insider threats and to monitor adherence to policies for officers who are currently sworn with the department? So to do that, we're going to, we have phase one has recently been completed, which was an archival data collection effort by a team of master's level students under the supervision of the team here. And we're going to follow that with phase two, which is a survey of a sample of 4,000 police departments. I'll get into that in a minute. And cross your fingers for a good response rate on that. And then phase three, hopefully, will be a series of interviews with folks who opt in after taking our survey. I want to pause and reflect for a minute. Right after we got this award, I was speaking with a friend who is a deputy chief in another state. And he was sitting in my office and he asked me, what do you have going on these days? And I mentioned this newly funded project, and he chuckled, like, oh, you silly academic, like, the sky's not falling. And I asked him, I said, well, what do you guys do about it? And there was this moment where he just kind of sat back and said, well, I don't really know. I assume it would be caught in the background investigation, but I don't know of any specific questions that we ask or anything we do to deal with that specific problem. He just assumed that it would get caught in the background investigation. I thought that was interesting. And so as I explained the project, he did become more intrigued by what we might find. So I mentioned that phase one was archival data collection. So we have a sample of 4,000 agencies that we drew from the National Database of Law Enforcement Administrators. We stratified it by the size of the agency in terms of the number of sworn officers that are employed there, and by whether it was a sheriff's agency or a municipal department. And so all told, we have about 740 agencies where we had our grad students go to their websites and scrape information about screening policies, about everything from what are disqualifiers to what are the minimum qualifications, and so on and so forth. And they've actually just recently completed building that database out, and we're excited to get into it. Unfortunately, I don't really have much to share with you today. Anecdotally looking through, you see some variation in terms of whether an agency mentions, for example, that tattoos are disqualifying, or whether quote unquote problematic tattoos are qualifying, or quote unquote visible tattoos are disqualifying. So I expect we'll see some variation in what agencies are doing. And over here, I just threw this map together just to show that we've got pretty good regional variation. We have at least one agency in 47 of the 50 US states. And obviously, by way of the sample that we drew, we have good variation in terms of the size of the agency and whether their leader is elected or appointed. So we'll be presenting more on what we find with the archival data next month at the ASC conference in Atlanta. So the next step then is to do those surveys and interviews. Again, a stratified random sample of 4,000 agencies. We'll address the agency to the chief or the sheriff of the department, send it in the mail, 2 waves of said survey. We'll give an online option, try to do everything we can to boost response rates. A lot of the research I do is survey-based, and I've not had great fortune lately with response rates. So big sample, if we get even just 10% response rate, we'll have 400 agencies giving us some information. And so it really, it unfolds in 3 parts. The first is, what sort of policies does the organization have? What sort of procedures are in place during the hiring and screening phase to try to filter out individuals who pose a threat to the agency in terms of their beliefs. And then second is about monitoring adherence among active personnel. So We see accounts in the news all the time about individual officers sending racist text messages or posting problematic information on social media. And so we want to know, what are agencies doing about that to monitor adherence? The third part of the survey is asking the individual respondent what their perceptions are about some of this stuff. What do they think should be done when it's found that an officer is posting problematic things on social media or pictures on social media? What do they think the extent of the problem is? What should be done about it? So on and so forth. And then lastly, we will invite the survey taker to participate and follow up in-depth interviews to try to tease out some richer information than we're able to get from the survey. So unfortunately, I don't really have much in the way of results to present because we haven't sent the survey out yet, but that's TBD, so thank you for your time.
Thank you all so much. So we've got about 7 minutes or so for questions. And Clara, who is somewhere around here, or Anthony, I've got another one of our wonderful grad students here at NCITE who's got a microphone on him for anyone asking questions. Though if nobody has, okay, Nadine has a pressing question.
So this is towards Dr. Nix, just because you just presented, it's top of my mind. So is thinking about the response rate problem to your survey, you talked about addressing the survey to chiefs, and I kind of wonder if that's the best strategy for actually getting a response rate. So wondering about whether or not deputy chiefs or people in charge of HR might be a better person to direct, if you can get that information, if you've thought about that. And then two, the response to the survey. So you can probably imagine that people who are going to opt in are going to be people that thought about it, and the people who are not going to opt in are ones that don't have policies, are not going to think about it. So wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, so it's a great question. And in the past, I've addressed to the chief or the sheriff, and in that cover letter, just ask them if they're not going to be the one taking it, which they often aren't, to forward it on to the appropriate person who's qualified to answer the questions being asked. The database that we use to draw our sample only provides information about the chief executive of the agency. So while we could go in maybe and scrape all 4,000 agencies' websites to get who the deputy chief is or someone from HR, I think that would be pretty challenging. We're going to hope that this is the best approach to address it to the chief executive and have them either take it or pass it off to the appropriate person. And hopefully we can get like a cover letter from a well-known executive or someone at DHS to try to give the survey a little more juice. That seems to work as well. The second part about the potential for non-response bias is one I think about every day. It keeps me up at night, in fact. I think that the best answer I can give you is we won't know because we won't have information from the non-respondents, but that's the point, I think, or part of the point of the archival data collection is that at least if we don't hear from them on the survey, we'll know what they're doing, at least according to their websites. And that's really the best we can do with this survey method.
It's a great question, thank you. I see a hand in the back.
Neil Woolen at the National Strategic Research Institute. I'm not sure who to address my question specifically to, so I would welcome a response from anyone who wants to grab it and go. But as I look at the threat, and especially under this category of preventing terrorism, and look at the risk realization component of terrorism being a product of threat that there is a vulnerability that could be affected by that threat. Have we looked at how a vulnerability score, whether it be for an individual, an organization, or a nation state, what are the compounding factors that lead to someone becoming more vulnerable? Again, whether it be the individual, an organization, or a nation state. Things like, do we know that there are certain behaviors, values, things like that that would make someone more vulnerable? And then on the flip side of that, looking at, are there ways to message your values more effectively to decrease that score? Or in the in the case of a nation state, it can soft power. You know, we know a lot of nation state hard power elements make them a target for terrorist organizations. So are there soft power elements that a nation state could implement, humanitarian assistance, medical response to helping countries, things like that, that could help maybe decrease their vulnerability and you know, with targeting for terrorism? So just some things rattling around my brain. I thought I'd throw it out and see what some people had to say about it.
Answers, I'm sure, from everybody. Does anyone want to take?
I can address it a little bit.
Go for it,
At
Deb.
least parts of it. When it comes to reintegration, we know there's certain challenges that have been reiterated over and over and over again. Is my mic on? Sorry. Am I good? There's certain reintegration challenges. So one is that if, you know, it's one for someone to be willing to reintegrate, but two, there also needs to be the community to welcome them. And that could be jobs, welcomeness, stigmatization, things like that. And so a lot of the interviews that we have done have focused on the barriers to reintegration. So again, we don't talk about de-radicalization, we talk about reintegration. That isn't to say that what's going on in someone's mind has completely changed, but what's important to understand is how do we get someone to be a contributing member of society again? And the number one thing is having a job and being accepted by, you know, your society and that you're in, the lack of stigmatization. And so we have challenges for how to get people to accept people who have been formally associated with a terrorist organization back into society. And we're dealing with it on a much smaller scale. As I mentioned, 25,000 women and minors from Iraq, and they're dealing with this on a much, much larger scale. And when we talk to them, they say this is one of the biggest issues, is getting society to welcome these individuals back in. And so the counter messaging aspect of that is extremely important. How we frame these individuals, how we kind of are open. A lot of it has to do with stigmatization, right? If you say this is a former member associated with the Islamic State, there's a stigma there. But if you say this is someone who is looking to reintegrate and not necessarily hiding their past, but communicating their past in a clear way, but also not necessarily branding them as a terrorist or former terrorist. We talked a lot in the Netherlands about this. They have a lot of kind of, they're not hiding it, but they're also not promoting it too publicly, right? Like if you really want to get someone to come welcome back into your village, you can't label them as a terrorist, but you also have to be open about the process these individuals go through. They don't just leave the Islamic State and immediately enter society. There's a lot of programming that's involved there. There's a lot of security that's involved there as well. And so you have to communicate that to individuals so that they know, but by the time that person ends up back in their society, they've been through a process. And so that communication is extremely key.
We're pretty much out of time here. I think that this is one of the big questions and one of the big problems that is still plaguing really understanding this field of preventing terrorism and targeted violence, is understanding and what these risk and protective factors are at both an individual and at a societal level, and what those look like and how they are differentiated from the individuals who are more at risk versus the rest of society who might not be at risk. And that is something that's an ongoing challenge for all of us who study crime in general and terrorism and targeted violence specifically. So thank you all so much.